Good afternoon and welcome to this America First Policy Institute webinar on Russia and Ukraine, what happens next and why it matters. I'm Fred Fleitz, Vice Chairman of the AFPI Center for American Security. This live webinar is an opportunity for us to provide you with real-time analysis by experts on a vital national security issue. Also, this is going to be an opportunity for you to ask some questions of our experts. And to do this, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you're watching this live on Zoom, there's an area for questions and you can type in your questions for our experts and we'll ask them towards the end of the session. This program also is being recorded so you can watch it later and share it with your friends. Well, I think we all know that this Ukraine situation is perhaps the most serious national security crisis our nation is facing quite a while. Russia has amassed 120,000 troops on the border. We've seen a incoherent response by the Biden administration, and we don't know whether Putin is going to invade or not. This is really a time where we have to have some expert analysis to figure out what this means. And I'm pleased to say we have two extraordinary experts with many years of national security experience to discuss and explain this today. General Keith Kellogg is co-chair of the Center for American Security at AFPI. Kellogg is a highly decorated three-star Army general. He served as acting national security advisor to President Donald Trump, national security advisor to Vice President Pence, and chief of staff and executive secretary at the National Security Council. General Kellogg has wide-ranging experience in Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa. He also writes extensively on national security issues and is a Fox News contributor. General Kellogg's recent book came out in 2021, War by Other Means, a general in the Trump White House. General Kellogg, welcome.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Also joining me is Dr. Kiron Skinner, who recently joined AFPI as a member of our Board of Academic Advisors. She is the Tobey Professor of International Relations and Politics at Carnegie Mellon University's Institute for Politics and Strategy. She also is the W. Glenn Campbell Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. During the Trump administration, Dr. Skinner was the director of the State Department Office for Policy Planning and a senior advisor to the Secretary of State. She has published extensively on American politics and international relations and is a Fox News contributor. Two of Dr. Skinner's co-edited books on President Ronald Reagan were New York Times bestsellers. One received the Hoover Institution's Uncommon Book Award. Dr. Skinner, welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
I want to start today by asking both of our panelists for their overview of where the Ukraine crisis is right now. What is Putin's strategy? Do you think he's going to invade? And let's talk about how the Biden administration has been responding. Dr. Skinner, let's start with you.
First of all, I'd like to, again, thank you, Fred Fleitz, for hosting this webinar. I am thrilled to be part of the new Academic Advisory Board of AFPI, and to be on a panel with General Kellogg is an honor and pleasure. We met during the 2016 Trump transition. I think he'll remember those days in the GSA building on the second floor, or maybe he wants to forget those days, but we survived it and then engaged again in Normandy when President Trump was there. It was a beautiful day of our nation coming together with others to remember the fallen heroes. So we've come full circle. AFPI, I think, is going to be not only a force in Washington, but around the country, throughout the country and around the globe on issues of foreign and defense policy, along with economic policy and domestic matters as well. So this is exciting. You've just asked, Fred, some really hard questions, and you've asked lots of them. So I'll try to do my best in a very short period of time. Because I know that we have many questions from the audience, and General Kellogg's perspective is critical. Ukraine, Russia. Russia, I think, is doing a number of things. It looked at 2021, the first 6 months or so of the Biden administration, and thought, you know, we need to probe this administration for the weakness that we see, to see how far we can go. And I think that's part of this story, is really probing, is there resolve in the Biden administration? I've said on air, and I'll say it again, the Afghanistan situation really is a background shadow to all that's going on now. The U.S. role and it's the way that it pulled out of that country, the lack of will, the lack of determination and commitment to those who had supported our nation. If we can't support those who stood alongside us for 20 years in Afghanistan, are we going to support Ukraine? I think that's a legitimate question. So I think there's a probing function. And there's also a desire by Putin, which he has said, to reconstruct the old Soviet bloc, to rewrite the economic, political, and military map of Europe so that the old Soviet bloc is back in the Russian Federation. Maybe not necessarily in the way it was during the Cold War, but in a deeper, closer alliance. And through Nord Stream 2 and the energy dependency of Western Europe on Russia, it has a lever that was the Biden administration helped give to it. As Germany attempts to certify Nord Stream 2, it's removed an important lever in dealing with Russia. This is one big opportunity for Putin to try to rewrite the map of Europe. There's been no better time in the post-Cold War world. And then third, I would say that not only is Putin probing the United States, he's watching to see what global partners do, how nations come together or don't to attempt to stop its malicious behavior. And we're finding some very interesting empirical data points from that last point I made. I'll stop there, and I'm willing to take questions.
Well, before we go to General Kellogg, I just want to ask a really blunt question. Do you think Putin will order an invasion of Ukraine?
I don't think now. And I think that what he wants, and I've said this before, is not to have to invade, to so weaken the will and resolve of the Ukrainians, of those in the region and around the globe, and expose the US for weakness, show the fractures in the transatlantic relationship, that it's a de facto win. That's a superior outcome. And I think he's trying to work in that direction. Whether he succeeds is a different question, but there's no need to invade if you have a weak deterrence from the other side. And I think that's what he's trying to clarify right now.
That's great. Thank you. General Kellogg, can you give us your take on the current Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, Kiron, really great information and really a great laydown. Dr. Skinner really has it well done. And thanks, Fred. Thanks for having me. Look, I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. I grew up in the military, and then I went into the White House on the national security side of the house. And I was, as a national security advisor, but I would always tell the president and the vice president both, I said, you need to look at what's happening through the lens of your adversary. You kind of need to know where he's coming from so you can respond effectively in that regard. It goes back to what an old Chinese strategist, a guy named Sun Tzu, said, 200 years before the birth of Christ, when he said, and I'll paraphrase, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win all your battles. If you know just yourself and not the enemy, you're going to be about 50-50. If you don't know yourself and you don't know the enemy, you're going to be at zero. You're going to lose every fight. And I'm not too sure that this Biden administration is on the third part, where they don't really understand themselves and understand the enemy. So you look at it from what Putin is, from his viewpoint and what he is saying. And Kiron was right. He looks at himself as an incarnation of Peter the Great, as somebody who wants to recorrect Greater Russia. He's really not a Soviet. He's really a Russian at heart. And he wants to recreate the old Russian Empire to the best way he can. And he looks at it at NATO, and he looks at the West, and he says, you lied to me. And he takes it with a little bit of truth, because James Baker told Gorbachev when we were reuniting East and West Germany, we're not going to expand anymore to the East. Well, the three Baltics and then Poland later, they've expanded out there. So he doesn't trust us. Of course, we don't trust him either, and we shouldn't out there. And Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It's got its own borders, and they should be inviolate. But we let him get away with carving part of those borders away. And because of that, with no reaction, like what he did with Crimea, and also what he's recently done in Moldova, just to the south west of Ukraine, we've let him get away with taking some of that territory. He has aligned himself very well with what I call the order of battle. When you look at the forces he's put in position, he can go into Ukraine anytime he wants once he makes that decision. He's taken his best units. He moved them from Eastern Russia as well. He's put them into Belarus. He's put them on, which is to the northwest, to the north, to the northeast, to the west, and to the south. So he's got his forces in place if he wants to go. What he's looking for is not about these other discussions about investigations or looking at the inspections of missile sites. He wants an ironclad guarantee. His ironclad guarantee is this. He does not want Ukraine to be part of NATO. He doesn't want them to fall into the Article 5 umbrella. And we're talking NATO, and while we're responding as a NATO a response by putting forces into Poland and moving forces into Romania, we have to remind ourselves that Ukraine is not a NATO ally. They don't fall under the Article 5 umbrella that the other 30 nations have protecting them. But look, I don't think he's ever going to go against NATO. I mean, it'd be, candidly, I'll put it in very simple terms. It'd be 30 nations, NATO, against 2, Belarus and Russia. He doesn't stand a chance. He's really more of a regional threat than he is a global threat compared to the old Soviet days. I mean, the comment I make with a little bit of its tongue in cheek. You know, when I look at Russia, they're Belgium with nuclear weapons. But that's something we have to consider, that the willingness to use the nuclear weapons on the battlefield, and he's got the capability to do so if he wants to. So I think we have to look at that, continue to reinforce Ukraine, and my position is to make him an unsinkable aircraft carrier, make the penalty for Russia to go in there so heavy they won't do it. And I would tell him, if I was President Biden, I'd pick up the phone and call Vlad and say, look, bud, if you thought Afghanistan was bad for Soviet Union, you ain't seen nothing yet if you go into Ukraine and what it's going to mean to Russia, and push back in that regard. But I don't think he's got that message yet that has been sent to Putin, because as Dr. Skinner said quite well just a little while ago, is that in our past history of what Biden has done with Afghanistan and what we've seen around the world, that he is basically not sure if he gets a kind of a green light, he can go. Remember, President Biden in his news conference said, Fred, that, well, you know, we're going to see what kind of incursion it is. And if it's a minor incursion, well, maybe that's okay. Well, that's the biggest green light you could ever give to Putin. So I'm not too sure where he's going to go. Do I think he's going to do an invasion of Ukraine proper, the entire country? No. It's the second largest country in Europe. 100,000 troops won't fix that. I don't care, you know, how good they are. But I think he would be willing to carve out a piece of Ukraine, primarily to the east of the Dnieper River, which is a demarcation line to the predominantly Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, with the rest of Ukraine. Because when you go west of the Dnieper, the Russian influence isn't as great as it is to the east of that. So there's a natural demarcation line to do it. Do I think he's going to go in the near term? No. I think the Olympics are starting tonight. Then the opening ceremonies tomorrow. He doesn't want to embarrass President Xi, but he's going to be an honored guest of President Xi there. But he's aligning himself. Xi's aligning himself with him. And and I'll close with this. Here's probably the biggest thing I'm concerned about. As we go down this line, you're going to see a restart of what they called the Tripartite Pact in 1940, where you had Japan and Germany and Italy. What happens if all of a sudden you see a pact between Russia, China, and Iran? And then you've got a real problem on your hands going forward. And I don't think we push back on that enough as we should of the concerns. Now, I said final, this is my final concern. My biggest concern is that every time we focus in on Russia and Ukraine, we forget to look at our greatest adversary that's growing, and that's China. And
General, I'm going to get to that later.
Every time we do that, we put ourselves in a huge disadvantage.
Yeah, I have a special question for you on China, but I want to ask you a follow-up, drawing on your experience serving our country in the Army. We have this 120,000 troops, Russian troops deployed on the Ukraine border at a high state of readiness, ready to invade. How long can Putin keep them there without withdrawing them or ordering an invasion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because the longer you keep troops in the field, the harder it is to supply them and keep them ready to go. So that's the reason I'm saying, okay, I thought there was a potential to go before it. And I think the time spent on the Olympics is time to really push up the diplomatic level, because after that, I think he's going to be primed to go. And after that, it really does start to draw down on your readiness levels. You can't keep you're right, you can't keep troops like that out there indefinitely. And he's pulled a lot of troops from Eastern Russia as well. And they need to go back to home station sooner rather than later.
Dr. Skinner, what does this crisis tell you about the state of NATO, the unity of NATO and the relationship between the United States and NATO?
I think it says that the administration that campaigned on restoring America's credibility in the transatlantic relationship is in free fall. And what we see happening is that NATO and European partners and allies are taking leadership on their own. You've got the Brits and the Poles coming together. You have the Hungarians and some in the high north forming these kind of loose alliances with emissaries to Kiev, some with close ties to Putin, having discussions and attempting to cut deals that don't include the United States. I think it exposes us not as the leader of the alliance, but as a struggling partner. And it's sad to watch, actually. And that's not where the United States should be. And as General Kellogg knows, of all the regions in the world when we were in the Trump administration, where there was a difference between the public and media rhetoric and the reality, it was with NATO and Europe. We had restored American credibility. The work that Ambassador Rick Grenell did in Germany, he was derided by so many for being tough on Nord Stream 2, on a whole host of issues that the Germans ultimately caved on. It's a very different time. And so we've got countries who are, one, doing the Western bidding apart from the United States. And then we have the wild card of Germany, which is, the largest trading partner for Russia in Europe, and is at the heart of the Nord Stream 2 issue. It's not a great time.
Yeah, if I can, Fred, because Dr. Skinner just nailed it. When you look at the alliance, it's a really fragmented alliance that you're seeing. Look, Hungary, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, just visited Moscow, and they talked about going, some type of relationship going forward. You have Macron of France trying to cut almost like a separate deal and wanting to have a European-based response as well. And you see that kind of a breakaway where they're kind of not really caring about what we're doing. And part of it is our own fault. And look, when you look at someplace like, Macron of France, we just concluded a sub deal with the Australians and the British, the nuclear sub deal that the French thought they had in their back pocket. And we forgot to even tell them about it. And even President Biden admitted that. So what did the French do? Well, they withdrew their ambassador for the first time in the history of the US and France. That kind of shows the dissatisfaction they have. And I think when you look at the fragmentation of the alliance, when you look at Germany, and that's my concern with the Germans, who still haven't spent 2%, as they've agreed to in the Wales Declaration, on their GDP on defense, of which 20% of that was modernization. And they've said they're never going to get there. This is a country that imports 90% of their energy, of which 30% of that comes from Russia. And what did they do just recently? When the Brits were sending anti-tank weapons into Ukraine, the Germans sent 5,000 used military helmets, and they forced the Brits to fly around Germany to get into Kiev to deliver that. So that shows you what kind of relationship is currently happening in Europe with the NATO alliance. I think they're very concerned about Russia. The Germans are, when you look at the Germans, and after living in Germany for 5 years in the military, they've always been very, very wary of Russia. They've fought 2 wars with Russia and have not come out well at all. And they know that, and it's kind of in the back of their mind, they always like that. And you've got a center-left government currently in Germany, and they're really kind of the linchpin. If the Germans are not going to go there, that's really going to fragment NATO.
If I could add just one more point on to support what General Kellogg has said, and I'm glad he gave the more military perspective because it's so critical. He talked earlier about a tripartite alliance with China, Russia, and Iran. But when you look at what's going on in Europe, you've got similar kinds of alliances forming with the U.S. not as a member. You've got Poland, Britain, and Ukraine talking about a trilateral alliance. It's really all over the place. And the US is somewhere in the background, sometimes not there. Also, the US has approved the selling of, I have someone at my door, I'm sorry, this is live, but the Baltic states selling Stinger missiles to the Baltic states. What signal does that send to Putin? This isn't going to be an air war. It's just a weak move by the United States.
No, I think that's exactly right. I'm going to let Dr. Skinner answer her doorbell and go to General Kellogg. And General, I really wanted to ask you a robust question about China. And looking at the Ukraine crisis in light of China, we know Putin and Chinese President Xi are meeting at the Olympics in Beijing tomorrow. And I mean, I know this is an important topic for you, and it comes right down to what lessons are Chinese officials learning from this Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, Fred, it's a great question because what it comes down to is leadership. And when you look at it, what kind of leadership do they see here in the United States of America when it comes to national security? And they look at a president who I believe is very weakened. He became very weakened, not only by his past history, but also by his actions in Afghanistan. And that was an absolute debacle by anybody's, view of what happened. But this is an individual, he meaning Joe Biden, who is the commander in chief under Article 2, Section 2. He kind of leads the military, leads the national security apparatus going forward. But he's also the gentleman that was, when we wanted to go after Osama bin Laden sitting there in the Situation Room, he's the one who recommended to President Biden that they not go. He's also the same gentleman who Secretary Gates, former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, said has been nearly wrong on every national security decision in the last 40 years. And it was also Joe Biden who President Obama said, don't underestimate Joe's ability to screw something up. The students there, both Xi and Putin, are students of history. And they're going to be in their positions a long time. It looks like Xi's going to get another term. And it looks like Putin has changed the Russian constitution that he can serve as president if he wants till 2036. So he knows that both of them know they're going to be there a long time. And the opponents always take measure of their adversaries. And they're taking a measure of President Biden every single day. And they see weakness. And weakness will, when you see it show weakness, the aggressor will fill that void. And they're starting to see that. I think the Chinese are going to do it, as well as the Russians, and I know the Iranians are. And in fact, I just read a report, I think today, that they could have a nuclear breakout, meaning enough fissionable material to build a nuclear weapon within a year or less than that. I think you're going to see a nuclear breakout there, and we're not going to do anything about it, and which is totally destabilizing to the rest of the Middle East. So I think everybody sees that. One thing, and I understand President Trump had, quote, the mean tweets, but he was very resolute in national security. He would make decisions rapidly, and they were hard decisions. I used to say, and I'll use an American hockey term, when you drop gloves, it means you're ready to fight. President Trump was ready to drop gloves at any time he needed to protect American interests. And he did that. And probably the greatest example is when we went after Soleimani, after the Iranians were messing around with the Iraqi supporters against the American embassy and killed an American up near Erbil. So they're just reacting to weakness. And that's a weakness that's being shown on a daily basis.
I want to ask Dr. Kiron about the Ukraine crisis in terms of China. And Kiron, what do you think Putin and Xi are going to be talking about in Beijing?
That they've got great fortune right now. And I want to, before I answer that, I want to go back to something that General Kellogg triggered in my thinking as we look around the European map. We haven't mentioned Turkey. But, you know, we have Erdogan going to Ukraine as a Black Sea state. He's both a NATO member, his country has relatively good relations with Russia. I don't think these leaders are checking in with Washington before they do what they're doing. And we can't say that enough. It's really hard to do, to have a deterrent strategy when you don't have even half the cohesion that you need. I just think that's important to note. But on the issue of China and Russia, I have been saying for years, and I think now some of the Russia and/or China experts said, when I began saying it 5 years ago, oh, no, there's no coordination between China and Russia. There never will be. And I just point to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not NATO, it's not the EU. But it is a coordinating activity for China and Russia, and it has picked up a number of states in the global south, like Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, others that we need. Either they are members or en route. Some of those same countries are part of the NATO Global Partners Program. What are we doing there? We need those countries, the broader community, as much as we need our NATO partners to deal with Russia, to deal with China. And I see no discussion at this moment of heightened crisis about the larger global partners to NATO, which include many from the global south. But you see a lot of activity with China and Russia. So I think they'll be laughing about their great fortune. They'll be further coordinating using their mechanisms like SCO, their friendship, their sets of relationships, and planning the future, not just of the European map, but of the global map.
Well, Dr. Scott, if I can just for a second, please. Kiron's so right about that. I remember the old term, wait for me, I am your leader. Well, I think that's the way it kind of looks right now with the United States. It's they're really out in front of us. A lot of them are, and they're ignoring what we're doing.
Dr. Skinner, I want to ask another related NATO question, and that concerns what the Russians are calling Putin's key demands that the Biden administration reportedly is ignoring, specifically renunciation of NATO strike systems near the Russia border, a promise that NATO will not be expanded further, and a return to NATO's 1997 membership and borders. Now, is this just something the Russians are throwing out to trade away? Are they serious about it? What's your view on these demands?
I think General Kellogg said something that was a bit of a correction to something I said, which really is consistent with the work of Anne Applebaum, who just understands Putin, Russia, and this part of the world as good as anyone, I think. And that is, this isn't just about reconstructing the old Soviet bloc. It's about the Russian Empire. I think the Soviet bloc is a dream, pushing the West out of NATO, but there's a larger objective, which I really believe Putin believes in. And General Kellogg is right. He's not so much a Soviet as he is a Russia empirist, if there's such a word. And I do think he's serious about having Eastern Europe out of NATO, about having a pledge of Ukraine never being part of NATO. I don't think he's just blowing smoke here. This is what he believes. And we have to take him seriously in that regard. But something else, Fred, that you mentioned that's coming up in this whole set of discussions, dialogues, negotiations, whatever one calls it, between the Europeans and or the West and Russia. And it's, to me, the most troubling of all, because I think it has near-term consequences that become almost impossible to unravel in the longer term. And that is, if you listen closely to our State Department, they're having discussions with the Russians about new arms control agreements, about confidence building measures, about reducing missile deployments, about reducing the number of military exercises. It sounds to me like the old détente of the 1970s and of preemptive concession making. it seems to me that this is not the time for those discussions at all. And to me, it signals to Putin American weakness at a much more fundamental level than we've discussed so far. What got Ronald Reagan elected in 1980? As much as the fact of, high unemployment, high inflation, 21% prime interest rate in December 1980, all of that was a factor, but was the failure of détente. That we had made a set of concessions to the Soviet Union that took years to unravel. If we do that in the next couple of years around arms control and these related issues that I've just mentioned, I think we're toast in Europe.
So would you agree that the Biden administration has already offered some fairly substantial concessions to Russia, including rejoining the INF treaty, and maybe Putin is just looking for more?
Yes, in one word, yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. General Kellogg, I'd like you to talk about how Putin has played this situation. He seems to be a master strategist in working in complex situations like this. His foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been there for 18 years. And it just seems in terms of the two teams, we've been outplayed at every level. But I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Well, yeah, I think he has. I made a comment that said he plays chess while we play checkers, and he's pretty smart about it. He's surrounded himself with people he trusts and knows for many years. The Saviki, these are people that he's very comfortable around and have been there for a long time. We're talking 5, 6, 7, 10 years out there. So it's a natural organization he feels very comfortable with. He's also thinking, and when he does stuff, I think we have to think through what he's actually asking for, because some of the stuff he's asking for are throwaways, and that we're going to fall for those. I think it comes down to what Dr. Skinner said as well. The biggest thing he's looking for is the fact he does not want Ukraine to be part of NATO, and it's a territorial look, because he believes it's a real threat on his borders. But he looks at that because he really does believe that it's a threat to Mother Russia, and he wants to expand Russia and the importance of Mother Russia going forward. And Ukraine's the perfect place for him to do it. I think it's very dangerous if we just underestimate what he's going to do or what he plans to do out there, because we have a tendency to think like Westerners. Well, the threat relationship is just too great. He won't do it. Yeah, he will. He'll take a gamble, and he'll push that gamble as far as he can. His favorite sport is jiu-jitsu. So using your balance against yourself and the advantage of throwing weight and making sure you become imbalanced by playing that game, that's what he does. That's how he kind of lives on a daily basis. And I think we have to be very attuned to that. And that's how he thinks. So I think the threat against Ukraine is very, very real. And he thinks a little bit ahead. What I mean by ahead, okay, what is my next step going to be? We counter, he's going to counter the counter. Then we're going to counter the counter, the counter. He's going to counter the counter, the counter, the counter. That's kind of how you do it. And he's going to be able to do that because he's got time on his side and space on his side. What I mean by that, his forces there are on the border. He doesn't necessarily have to remove them right now. I think over time he has to, because they become very stale and he's got to train them, and they lose capability the longer they stay there. But he's got what we called in the military, he's got internal lines. What I mean by that, his throw is very short, where he can support from.
Before I go to Dr. Skinner, excuse me, Dr. Skinner, before I go to Dr. Skinner, I want to remind our audience that we will be taking your questions. And if you want to send us questions, go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be turning to my colleague, Dr. Jacob Alldorf, shortly, and he's going to read them out, and we'll see where you are. I'd like to get your response to that question, Dr. Skinner, but I also would like you to comment on all these confusing statements by the Biden administration on whether there's an imminent threat, and the feuding with the Ukrainian government, where apparently we told them it's a imminent threat, and that they complained about that, and then the Ukrainian government, the Biden administration denied that they had said that. What is this leading to?
I think it's just patently obvious to say it's such a bad look for the White House and for Kiev to be, in a rhetorical battle about whether this is an imminent threat or not, lack of coordination at that level suggests almost no coordination beneath. And so that's, to me, of great concern. But it goes back to, I think, another issue. We didn't have a Europe policy or strategy before this buildup by Russia on the Ukrainian border. It is hard in real time to get one. And that's the problem. In 2021, and even before, the Biden forces weren't developing grand strategies for anything, whether you like Donald Trump or not. And he was a tough guy. And it was hard to sit through some of his tweets. But there was a Trump doctrine. And one of the things that got me most in trouble in my time in government is, one, I said there was one, and then I proceeded to explain its various pillars. I don't think anyone can explain the various pillars of a Biden doctrine because there's not a doctrine to begin with. And that's not an easy pot shot that I'm trying to make for talking points with a sympathetic audience or on television. I challenge anyone to lay out the Biden doctrine, and I'll stand corrected. There is a big idea that Biden has had for years about democracy, and that democracy needs to be bolstered in the world as an alternative to authoritarian regimes because there are a whole set of countries in the world that sit on the fence. No one can disagree with that. That's an empirical reality. That is also an aspiration for us to have more of the democratic free column. But what's beneath that? And that's what I think Putin is watching. Not only is he probing for weakness and strength, I think he's probing for the theory of the case. And the administration doesn't have it. It's not just that world leaders are watching Biden, they're watching his team. And it's his team that's pushing for all these arms control and détente-like measures. And that suggests that I think they don't have a strong argument. And for everything that Trump may have done wrong, there was an argument.
Let me, Fred, real quickly, if I can reinforce one thing Dr. Skinner said, because it's so true. You are required by law as an administration to have your national security strategy done within your first year. We did it in the Trump administration. We had it done complete in the first year and we published it. Go find, public question to ask, go find not the interim national security strategy, find the national security strategy of the Biden administration. It's not there. They haven't done one. So if you can't put out what you're thinking or what's in your strategy, then it's really hard to talk about it. Dr. Skinner nailed it. It's exactly right.
And I also wanted to add real quick, if I may, to finish addressing Fred's point, his question. What's Putin really doing? I think he's trying to sap our energy, divert our attention, buy time. This administration has shown that it doesn't multitask very well. The president has decided he's going to do a cancer moonshot in the middle of the failed policies around the pandemic. This is a way to further sap the energy of this administration, which is relatively low in energy to begin with. I think if you're asking me what will Putin and Xi talk about at the Olympics, I think it's part of this bigger strategy of just keeping the administration, running, reacting, but never stopping to figure out what all of this means knitted together. And I think they're getting a clearer sense. There won't be a theory. There won't be a strategy.
Before I turn to Jacob Olador, I just want to note, Kiron, I was so proud to work with you. You were in the State Department. You were really a lonely voice of reason trying to push President Trump's America First approach to national security. And I'm so glad that you've joined the AFPI Academic Board of Advisors. I know we can really use you. So once again, welcome.
Well, thanks on that. I know you need to talk to Jacob, but while we're having a little bit of a love fest here, I will say, had we had the AFPI structure in 2016, we'd be in a different world in
Yeah.
2022. And as a political scientist, I will say that, and this may be a bit unpopular in Washington with all the political operatives who are on every street corner, but policy also wins elections. And I think that Trump came so close in a year of 2020, which as an academic was one of the hardest years, post George Floyd, the pandemic, all these things happening, the election being contested all at once, and Trump came close. And a lot of it had to do with the policies that so many Americans from diverse communities benefited from, both at home and abroad. And had we had AFPI, we would have had a really different personnel situation in the administration. I just applaud the work you're doing, and I hope that it translates into whoever wins on our column in 2024, different personnel.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'd like to invite Dr. Jacob Oladort, who is a director with the AFPI Center for American Security, to ask some of our audience questions. Jacob, do we have any questions?
We have quite a few indeed, a very stimulating conversation. So I'll try to, in the interest of time, package them together and kind of make for an interesting discussion. The first is, why does what happens in Ukraine matter to Americans? Why should Americans care? And what happens next if Putin does some move on Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. I'm willing to jump in on that one and say that it's been of a great concern to me that the administration hasn't made the case to the American public. And in the absence of making the case to the American public that Ukraine is in our national interest, Americans will not support a broader, I think, military effort by the US there. It is the job of the commander-in-chief to be the communicator-in-chief as well, especially on issues of high national security importance. And I cannot answer that question from a Biden administration perspective. I can answer it from a America First perspective. And from that perspective, it's my thought that Western security is our security. It doesn't mean that we go to war in every case. It doesn't mean that we send our boys and girls into harm's way, but it does mean that we evaluate every crisis from the standpoint of Western security. What's happening in Ukraine and its surrounding countries, I think, is ground zero for American security, because it will determine the future of Western security.
Yeah, Jacob, where I'm coming from, there was a recent Trafalgar poll that was published in Newsweek just a week ago. It said roughly 15.8% of the Americans believe we should get involved in Ukraine. To me, the importance of Ukraine is not the geographic importance of it or the physical importance of it. It's the leadership part of it. If they see that the leadership of the United States is weak, ineffective, and won't make the hard calls, then it becomes a very, very dangerous world, because people will move to that vacuum out there. So the importance of Ukraine is a little bit different, because people think, well, it's a country, it's a large landmass, the Russians have got troops, there's going to be fighting. It's much deeper than that. It's what's the will of the American people. It's what's the will of the president. Over 9 months ago, I was in a group think on a major network, and somebody asked me, what's your biggest concern? What keeps you awake at night? And I said, the will of President Biden. Does he have the will to make the hard decisions and then follow through with those decisions? And if he doesn't, then the United States is in trouble, and it'll keep me awake at night. So that is, to me, is the importance of Ukraine, because it shows will. Do we have the will to make the hard calls and follow through with the hard calls? And right now, I think the jury's still out. Reinforcing NATO is not a hard move to make, okay? And because it's part of NATO. And we've got the London Treaty, the NATO treaty. We're supposed to support our allies, the 30 allies that are there right now. It doesn't apply to Ukraine. So how do you do that in a very, very disciplined way and in a different way? And I'm not too sure that the Biden administration and his advisors have thought through that.
Excellent. The next question, kind of a related point, and this is about both Russia and China. Do they see an opportunity, a window of opportunity for provocative action before a weak president, meaning the current president, is replaced? And I guess what might that look like, and what should Americans be concerned about?
Well, I'll take that one. I think it's the jury's out. Depending on what they want to do in a crisis situation. I think when you're looking to the immediate crisis, they look at Ukraine, they look at Taiwan. I shift a little bit. The biggest crisis I'm currently thinking about after we get through the Russia-Ukraine business, and then we keep focusing back in on China, is the breakout of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And if you get an Iran that breaks free, a nuclear breakout, and their alliance they've had with the North Koreans and others out there to supply them missile technology, it's the largest missile fleet in the Middle East with the Iranians. I think you've got a major problem on your hand because I don't think the Saudis will support that. The UAE will support it on just letting the Iranians have that. So I think all of a sudden that'll jump in your face real fast because I'm sure the Israelis will not support that. And you could be looking at a major issue in the Middle East over nuclear weapons and a breakout there. So while we're focusing in on Russia, and I think part of Russia is a domestic issue, we can't seem to let it go. It goes back to Russia, Russia, Russia. And what I mean by that is everybody's so focused in on from the 2016 election on, we forget to look at the East with China, but more importantly, we're forgetting to look at what's happening in Iran because those talks that were there that are ongoing on to reconstitute JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, they're just not happening.
I'll address that as well. I agree with what General Kellogg has said. And I will add that I think Russia and China are looking at what our allies are even seeing. And that is that we're showing very little credible deterrence. And so not that Russia wants to invade Ukraine in the next 24 minutes or 24 hours or 24 days, but the deterrence isn't there. Deterrence to work has to be credible. And the Ukrainians keep saying, and some of the Central Europeans keep saying, and other partners and allies, impose your sanctions now. Don't wait for some big action. And the administration is loath to do that. It won't do it. And it has all kinds of reasons for not doing it. One, Germany won't go with the US. But just suppose we find the will to do it now. China and Russia are ready. 70% of Russia's electronics come from China. If we impose financial sanctions and export controls that influence, for example, or stop semiconductors going to Russia, it's a big deal because so many of our partners, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, are leaders in that field. China could say, we're not going with these sanctions. You can't catch us if we sell electronics to Russia, which we've already been doing, that include American products. What will the United States do? Because many of your allies aren't going to be with you. We should be working with the semiconductor leaders of the world, most of whom are our partners, to have a foolproof approach if we impose these, as the Biden administration keeps saying, unprecedented sanctions against Russia. We're talking about them, we're not doing them. Zelensky says, do it now. We don't even have the community of states ready to go. And I think China and Russia know that Russia its economy will be hurt, but China will be right there.
That's very well said, yeah. And I think it relates to the next question, and you touched on it, but what can the American people do right now? And I think probably Congress as well, seeing what they're seeing with everything going on, what sort of actions should the American people take?
I think they've been taking it, especially through some of our legislators. We have these almost citizen emissaries or diplomats going to Europe, going to Kiev, having conversations. When legislators go, I'm cheering because they're trying to look at the situation on the ground. They're trying to come back home with arguments to their communities about America's interest. I'd like to see the administration do more of that, but if we have to do it through other avenues, we have to do it. America's the best in the world at track to diplomacy. And I hope that AFPI does more of that, or does it and I hope to contribute working with those, right outside of government who can influence.
Kiron, can you explain what track 2 diplomacy is? Because most of our viewers won't know what that is.
Yes, if you'd like to explain it, you may have a better elevator's pitch on it, but I'm happy to go ahead. It's, we track 1, government to government, but track 2 is so critical. It's those in think tanks and national and international thought leaders who meet and convene and who have ties to their home capitals, who are huddling, who are discussing, who are passing information. We're just the best at it. We know how to do it. And I think that's actually happening now. I don't know all the details of all the actors, but I know that we have inspired many other capitals in Europe to really get busy on track 2. And we have to do it because I think our government's failing us.
Great. Yeah, Jacob, I want to make sure that we don't get too wonkish in that reply. What I mean by that is I'm not sure exactly how you paraphrase that when it says almost like, what can we do out there? Woe is me. And I said, the best thing the American people can do is stay informed of what's happening, and then get out there and be engaged in there as well out there. Because just because people live in Washington, D.C. and make the cardinal moves of the decisions doesn't mean they're always right. We used to call it flyover country, or the people that are out there. But I used to tell people what's very, very important is what happens in Washington, Kansas, as much as happens in Washington, D.C. And that's one of the reasons we put together the America First Policy Institute. America First doesn't mean America alone, but it means that the primacy is on the American people. What we should be supporting what the American people want first. And once our house is really solid, then we can make sure other people's houses are solid as well. So when I say that, I want to make sure that if somebody was out there saying, well, woe is me, what can I do? Just stay engaged. And I think the American people are very, very good at that. And you can see that here in Northern Virginia, where I live, when it comes to the education piece. And when they got engaged, things changed really fast.
Mm-hmm.
This is another question, and this was sort of addressed in the discussion earlier, but the reliability of Germany as an ally to the US, both their dependence economically on Russia, Nord Stream 2, of course, and then sort of what do we do about that? I mean, what's the way forward there?
Yeah, well, because I've been, I focused in a lot of them on the NATO side with President Trump at the time. Look, the Germans are not a good ally right now. And even Senator Ben Sass from Nebraska made that comment. He's questioning whether they're really part of NATO. It's almost like in their culture as well. And they're one on energy. They import 90% of their energy, of which 1/3 of that at least comes from Russia. And that's the reason why they put together the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I remember Angela Merkel told Vice President Pence in Munich Security Conference, well, we can turn the switch on and turn the switch off. Once you turn that switch on, it's going to stay on. You're not going to do that to yourself. And they're also at that time, and again in Munich with Merkel, is we asked them very point blank, are you ever going to get 2% of your GDP spent on defense? As you agreed, Angela Merkel, signed up to the Wales Declaration in 2014, that 2% GDP on defense, where 20% was modernization. And she told the vice president to his face, we'll never get there. Well, what kind of ally is that? Well, that tells you you're not even going to fulfill the obligations you have as a NATO ally. And they're the linchpin to me to the European alliance. And the real gap that's being filled is by the French. So when you look at Germany and what they're doing or not doing, I think it raises real questions about how should the alliance look in the future, and actually the support of Europe going forward to the alliance, not just the Germans, but if the Germans do this, or the Hungarians are going to do this, or the Czechs going to do it. And I think it raises questions of, if we're spending 3.5% in NATO, which we are, of our GDP, why should we not? Why is it not fair to demand that they spend 2% of their GDP? Or maybe we have to relook the equation of NATO, which I know is heresy, but maybe it's time we say it very hard. Look, if you're part of alliance, then you are part of an alliance, and you fulfill the obligation system of Article 5. But Article 3, which I would recommend people read, which I call the funding article, which you are required to fund yourselves for the common defense and the individual defense as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree with General Kellogg for being unvarnished in his assessment of what's happening with Germany. And it needs to be said over and over again. The Germans need to hear it. I hope they're listening. And, you know, I remember I was on the Defense Policy Board for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, when in those years when he talked about the old versus new Europe, and academics got very upset at him and you know, his reputation. He was you know, dissing so forth our Western European alliance. But the fact of the matter is that the Central and Eastern Europeans have the will, the interest, and the commitment to Western values and security. Those who do, we need to work with them as closely as we possibly can, meet with them constantly, help, you know, attempt to help shape their policies, grow their commitment to internal economic and political freedom, because we're going to need them in the years ahead. I think the Germans will realize that one day, but until they get the memo, we should be working very, very hard on the diplomatic channel and the military commitments we have, security guarantees with that other part of Europe, the new Europe.
Jacob, let's try to get one more question in.
Okay, one more. This is great discussion. In response to your question about a lack of strategy from Biden, what do you think Trump would have done had this crisis with Ukraine arisen?
Oh, good question.
Yeah,
I don't think we. You go, General Kellogg.
Dr. Skinner, you go first.
I don't think we'd be in this universe right now.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, we would not have been in the Afghanistan universe, and so we are in a different world now. And what's been surprising for me is that how quickly we moved to a new world. So I think that's a harder question to answer, because I don't think we'd be there.
Yeah, you know, remember that the Trump administration was the first to give Ukraine what I'd call lethal aid in the sense of javelins. Well, look, in 4 years, Ukraine didn't just happen today. You know, in 4 years, we never had an issue with Putin in Russia and Ukraine. It never came up. Crimea was in the Obama-Biden administration. It was pretty well quiet. And part of that was because what Trump would do, Trump had a wonderful way of picking up the phone and calling a leader and talking him down off the ledge if necessary. Trump had 18 phone calls with Putin. Many times it was just to say, hey, Vlad, how you doing today, bud? But there was a lot of reasons he would get involved. Trump would get involved. And Trump was able to keep stuff on the back burner. And a lot of that came down to why did that happen? It was because of personal leadership. Because if anything, Putin at least respected Trump and knew he was a positive leader, but he also knew that Trump was willing to fight if necessary. So it gave him pause. So in the 4 years of the Trump administration, was there issues with the Ukraine? Nope, not at all. It happened during the Biden-Obama administration, and it happened during this administration. You have to ask yourself why.
And remember, it was President Donald Trump who took on the INF Treaty and made a hard decision there. I don't think that decision would have been made. That was a strong, tough signal, along with many others, to Russia.
Well, Dr. Jacob Older, thank you for curating these questions. And I'd like to thank our expert guests, General Keith Kellogg and Dr. Kiron Skinner, for a truly illuminating discussion about the Ukraine crisis. Discussions like this would not be possible without the generous support of AFPI's members. To become an AFPI member and to learn about AFPI, please go to our website, americafirstpolicy.com. I might add that we're going to add a video of this webinar on our website and on our YouTube panel. I hope you'll take a look at it, share it with your friends. Also, we are planning more webinars like that, so please keep an eye out for them. So with that, I'm so grateful you joined us, and I hope you'll join us again soon.